The story of Israel's deliverance wasn't just about freeing a people from slavery. It was a declaration of who God is. Each plague wasn't random. It was a direct challenge to the gods of Egypt, proving that they were powerless before the Almighty. Even Pharaoh's own magicians had to admit, this is the finger of God. But why does this matter to us today? Because Israel's journey was more than just history. It was a picture of our own spiritual reality. Just like the Israelites were in bondage to Pharaoh, we were in bondage to sin. And just like God raised up Moses to lead them to freedom, He sent Jesus to deliver us once and for all. And here's where it gets personal. God didn't just perform miracles so the Israelites could see them. He did it so that they could testify about Him. And that's exactly what He calls us to do today. Our testimony of salvation isn't just our story, it's a weapon, a witness, a declaration of victory. So today we're diving deep into the power of a Christian testimony. Why it matters, how it overcomes, and what happens when we boldly proclaim what God has done in our lives. Let's get into it. So the nation of Israel was in bondage for many, many years. And they were slaves to some really harsh taskmasters. Now imagine being taken out of your own homeland, because there was a famine, of course, and moving to Egypt for the sake of your survival, and then being made into slaves, being beaten every day, being ill-treated with the sun coming down upon your head. Then God sends somebody to come and deliver you. And this is where Moses comes in. Moses was sent with the message of God and to perform miracles and to perform signs and wonders so that the Israelites would believe Moses had been sent by God, and to also demonstrate who God is to the Egyptians. And this is when the 10 plagues come in. When we read in Exodus, we see that God sends Moses to speak to Pharaoh, and the message that Moses shares with Pharaoh is accompanied by 10 plagues that God performs to try and persuade Pharaoh to let his people go. But these 10 plagues weren't just 10 plagues, as you could say, or 10 phenomena that occurred. They were a direct challenge to each of the gods of Egypt. For example, the Egyptians at the time had a goddess of fertility known as Hecate, and she was associated with the river Nile and with the frog head. So when God sent the plague of frogs, this was a challenge to Hecate. And when we see, for example, in Exodus 8 verse 19, the plague of the gnats, we saw earlier on that some of the plagues that God had sent, some of the signs that God had given Moses to perform, the Egyptian magicians were able to perform them by whatever powers that they had. But when it came to the gnats, the Egyptian magicians couldn't reproduce them. And in Exodus 8 verse 19, it records that they said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." So the plague served the purpose of showing the Israelites that God was active in their lives and showing the Egyptians that the gods that they were serving were no gods at all, and that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was the real God. Now, when we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 11, it says, "Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did." And it also says, "These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come." So the Israelites being set free from Egypt was not the end of the story. They still were taken through the wilderness. They saw God as a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. They felt the earth trembling and the mountain quaking when Moses was up on the holy mountain speaking to God face to face. And they saw God's miraculous wonders when He provided manna and quail each day and when He provided water from a rock. These things were done not only for the Israelites, but to also serve as a testimony to all the nations around that area, that there was only one God and his hand was mighty, and this is the God of the Israelites. So the deliverance of the Israelites is a picture for us, because just as the Israelites were delivered from their slave masters in Egypt, Jesus Christ came as a type and picture of Moses, a greater Moses, to come and deliver us from our sins, to come and set us free from the captivity of our sin. Another thing that our testimony does is that our testimony is there. Our testimony of salvation is there to help us overcome. When we read in Revelation 12 verse 11, it says, "They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death." And this makes me think, when you look at what happened to the apostles, to the 12 apostles, of course excluding Judas, each of the apostles died gruesome deaths. In fact, it's recorded by tradition that Simon the Zealot was sawn in two while preaching the gospel. And we know that Peter and his brother Andrew were both crucified, with Peter being crucified upside down because he felt unworthy to be crucified in the same manner as Jesus Christ. Paul, who was previously known as Saul, after he had his amazing encounter with Jesus Christ, he went on to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ up till the point he was beheaded in Rome. And we hear of other people like Thomas and Matthew and how they died such gruesome deaths. And you ask yourself, what exactly about the gospel, what exactly about their lives, what exactly about their encounter with Jesus would make these men not stop preaching the gospel, preach the gospel with such boldness that they would even go to their gruesome deaths because of their testimony? Their testimonies of salvation helped them overcome. They were not afraid to preach Jesus Christ. They were not afraid to go and stand on the street corners, in the synagogues, in different places, even in Rome itself, preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, because they had a testimony of how their lives had been radically changed, of how each and every one of them had been saved from their sin. And this is what our testimony does for us. That in times of trial, in times where things may seem very difficult, our testimony gives us the strength to overcome, as we've read in Revelation chapter 12. The next thing that our testimony does is it bears witness to the gospel. Jesus Christ, at one point in John chapter 4, is passing through a Samaritan town. And we know that the Jews and the Samaritans, they didn't get along. And Jesus stops to speak to a Samaritan woman and tells her whole life story. Because of that miraculous encounter, or because of that wonderful encounter with Jesus Christ, she goes into the town and she says to the people of the town, "Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did." That's in John chapter 4, verse 39. And we go on to read that the whole town believed because of her testimony. So our testimony bears witness to the gospel. In fact, Paul's exhortation in Timothy, when we read in 1 Timothy 4 verse 16, Paul says, "Watch your life and doctrine closely. Persevere in them. Because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers." So in other words, he's saying to Timothy, your testimony, your personal testimony, and the doctrine that you preach, what you know about Jesus Christ, guard those things closely. Watch your life. Don't let sin come into your life, creep into your life and destroy your testimony. Your testimony, by the way, can be destroyed by sin. But watch your life and your testimony closely. Because if you persevere in those, if you persevere in your doctrine and in your life closely, you will not only save yourself, but you will also save your hearers. Your hearers will look at your life. They'll see your testimony. They'll hear the things that you have to say, and they will turn to Jesus Christ because of those things. And the last thing I want to speak about, and in terms of the importance of our personal testimony, is that our testimony speaks for us when our words fail. Now, I'm trying to be more of a theologian. I haven't gotten there yet. In fact, I'm hoping to go to Bible school one of these days. I want to grow deeper in the Word. And I meet circumstances where sometimes I don't have the words to explain. My knowledge of apologetics is shallow in some circumstances. And I can't use words and philosophies and all these fancy things to explain my position and why I believe in Jesus Christ. It's something that I pray that the Lord gives me more experience in. But this is where our testimony comes in. When we don't have all these different lofty ideas and all these amazing things to say, our testimony speaks volumes. And I want us to look in the gospel of John. Jesus comes in John chapter 9. Jesus does a miraculous work in a man born blind. This man was born blind, and Jesus Christ heals him. He restores his sight. And the man goes on. And everyone is looking and saying, is this the same man who was blind and who we would find begging? To the point that when this man is brought before the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they call his parents to come and testify and say, is this your son? Is this really your son? And has he been blind all his life? And they pose different challenges to him. In fact, let's go together to that scripture in John chapter 9, if you would indulge me. In John chapter 9, in verse 20, it says, his parents replied, we know this is our son and that he was born blind, but we do not know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him. He is old enough to speak for himself. And it says that they said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. And so for a second time in verse 24, they called in the man who had been born blind and told him, God should get the glory for this, because we know this man Jesus is a sinner. And the man replied in verse 25, and this is where it becomes really important. I don't know whether he is a sinner, the man replied, but I know this. I was blind and now I can see. And this is what our testimony is there to say. Look, I don't know why God does what he does. I don't know why there's so much suffering in the world. I don't have the answers to a lot of questions. But I know one thing. I was blind and now I see. I was a slave to sin, but Jesus Christ has set me free. I was dying in my iniquity. My life was going totally astray. Everything in my life that could go wrong was going wrong, and I was lost. But now Jesus Christ has done a work in my life, and there's a total 360. In fact, my pastor used to tell the story of a young man who was living in a life of debauchery, who was living in a life of sin, of complete debauchery, and everyone in the community knew him till Jesus Christ came and set him free. And his life was totally turned around. And one day when he came to a church gathering or to a meeting, all he said was, you know me. And people were amazed, astonished, and many gave their lives to Christ. In fact, I know of such a guy. I won't mention his name because I haven't gotten the permission to share his testimony. But this guy was a drunkard, and I used to see him all the time, passing my gate. He was absolutely lost. He was drunk. You could see that his life had no purpose, no direction. But a few years ago, this man came to a gathering where I was. And when he stood up to speak, I had to question myself and ask, is this man the same? Am I getting this guy's face wrong? He looks so familiar. Till he mentioned his story, and I'm like, this is the guy. This is him. I know this guy. And today he stands testifying of what Jesus Christ did in his life. And so, like the blind man, that's what our testimony does for us. Where we may not have the multitude of words, but our testimony of what Christ has done for us is so strong that we can say like him, look, I don't know. All I know is I was blind and now I see. And God has done this for me. So that's all we have time for today. Thank you for tuning in to yet another episode of the Life in the Light podcast. I'm sorry we haven't had a couple of episodes in the past few weeks. Life has been a bit hectic for me. And as of 2 weeks ago, I am a father again. I've now got 2 kids. So you can imagine how busy and how hectic life is. But thank you for tuning in. As always, stay healthy, stay blessed, and may the Lamb that was slain receive the reward for his suffering.